This is Serious Grower Podcast. I'm Anna. I'm an entomologist. I'm a scientist, and I'm using this podcast to talk to all kinds of growers and eaters who are serious about their farms, their gardens, their local food systems, and I am asking, how can science help? Today's co-host is an expert, Elisabeth Hodgdon from Cornell's Veg team. If you listen to my weekly field reports, you have been benefiting from her work as the whole veg team at Cornell keep a close eye on vegetable pests across the state. But Elisabeth has been pounding the pavement and providing us with leek moth monitoring data. So a big thanks to her for holding the line up there in New York State. Also, if you've been listening to this podcast feed, you will have heard me gush about how lucky I am to be part of a network of extension specialists that like to get together in virtual space on the regular to get into the weeds about all the problems encountered by farmers in the Northeast. So folks in the Northeast are commonly limited by the size of their farm. So those small local farms who can't expand production spatially are getting really good at making the most of their space by expanding temporally. I am talking about expanding production into the colder months of the year by using season extension techniques, low tunnels, high tunnels, greenhouses, of course, but there's also some really nice approaches to overwinter open culture crops as well, with two added bonuses. Number one, you're dodging your insect pests by growing that crop during a time of year that the insect pests are not active. And number two, finding a little price premium by offering a local product during a time that it's usually not widely available. If you grow garlic, you already know this, but garlic is typically planted in the fall. They're protected from extreme cold with a layer of organic mulch, which is removed in the spring, and bulbs are pulled up from the ground in the summer to dry and go into storage. On the other hand, scallions, leeks, and storage onions, we usually call them bulbing onions, are traditionally planted in the spring and harvested by the end of the summer, depending on how long it takes for them to get to that harvestable stage. So scallions and leeks will go right to the market after harvest, while storage onions, garlic, and shallots are cured or dried out in warm, well-ventilated barns. Their outer skin turns that papery protective armor we see in the store. After they're cured, they go into these massive climate-controlled warehouses that keep them just above freezing, where they can rest happily for 6 to 9 months. New York State is a major producer of red, yellow, and white onions. So many of the cooking onions you see in grocery stores through the winter and spring come from New York, until those warehouses run empty and we start seeing onions being harvested from Georgia and Texas, dominating the shelves through the summer. Recently, we've been seeing more of those small-scale vegetable farmers in the Northeast adopt an overwintering strategy for those storage onions. But I will let Elisabeth explain.
I'm Elisabeth Hodgdon. I'm a regional vegetable specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension's Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program team. I'm based in Plattsburgh, New York, which is up in the northeastern corner near the border of Canada. So just to kind of set the scene for why we're talking about this today, in northern New York, high tunnels are very important for our farmers because we have such a short growing season. Just one extreme is one grower I work with who's in the Saranac Lake area in the Adirondacks. She gets frosts in June and then again sometimes in August. An extreme example of how short our seasons can be for some of the growers up here. Over the years, through funding with NRCS, folks have just acquired mini high tunnels. And because of that, they're able to expand the diversity of crops that they're growing in them. And so I have been seeing more overwintered onions. And I worked with Becky Seidman on her overwintered onion variety and planting date trials back in 2013-ish. It was a while ago. I am currently doing an overwintered onion variety trial at the Cornell Willsboro Research Station, which is in Essex County. So there was a need expressed by growers for updated varietal recommendations, and in particular for red varieties. And as part of that grant, yes, I'm doing the variety trial, but I'm also doing leek moth monitoring on farms. Through that, I've been looking at a lot of overwintered onions and also monitoring for thrips, just as an IPM scouting service for the growers that we're working with. And so I have noticed that thrips develop earlier in high tunnel onions, which makes sense, and trying to kind of apply the threshold for field onion thrips to high tunnel onions. I've just had some questions about whether that threshold is still applicable and what to recommend for organic growers, because in New York State, we have tougher pesticide regulations than some other states. And so in New York, a pesticide first has to be labeled for the pest and the crop But also, if you're applying the pesticide in a high tunnel, the DC considers that to be a greenhouse, even if you can roll up the sides, open the doors, make it a not fully enclosed space. They still consider that to be a greenhouse. If the pesticide label says that you can't use the pesticide in a greenhouse, you can't use it in a high tunnel. But more often, a label will be somewhat vague, or they might be silent on whether it can be used in a greenhouse. So if the pesticide label doesn't say if you can use it in a greenhouse, if it just doesn't mention that, you can't use it in a high tunnel in New York State. So that greatly reduces the pesticide options for all growers, but for organic growers in particular, there already aren't that many pesticide options.
I'm just going to jump here to kind of reiterate a point about the distinction between high tunnels and greenhouses, because you read a pesticide label, it will often say not for use indoors. For most of us who have been in a greenhouse, that feels pretty solidly indoors. For those of us who have been in a tunnel, it's just a piece of plastic over the ground. How is that indoors? And why would we have the same rules for that situation as a greenhouse? It really comes down to UV light. The rules about when and how much pesticide can be applied to our food take into account how long that pesticide residue will be out on those plants in the sun being degraded by UV light. Greenhouses and tunnels are both made of materials that block a lot of this kind of light, and that's why they're grouped together here. So many states have relied on like the Air Bud rule for this. There ain't a rule that says dogs can't play basketball, and most states allow products to be used in tunnels as long as it doesn't explicitly say not for indoor use. More states are adopting the New York rules on this, where that product can only be used in tunnels if it explicitly states that it can be used in indoor settings. So something to be aware of if you are selecting products in a high tunnel. But another benefit of being in a semi-enclosed area is that biological control is more likely to be worth thinking about. Biological control is basically relying on some other organism to do the dirty work of controlling our pests for us. Usually we can rely on the wild species on our farms to take care of most of us, the natural enemies. But not if you are growing indoors. They can't get to them. Luckily, you can purchase some of these natural enemies from insectaries. This is a really amazing thing. They can be a little pricey, but commonly worth the investment compared to severe pest injury. Back to my conversation with Elisabeth.
That's kind of required me to dig a little deeper on biological control options and some other kind of outside the box IPM strategies. But in the back of my mind, I'm also considering that the cost of everything for farmers has gone up, and farmers are juggling multiple crops and multiple pests. And how much do we really need to worry about these onion thrips that are taking off in the overwintered onions that are going to be harvested now or in June? And so that's kind of what brings us here.
So it seems like every year as we transition from winter into spring, us nerds love to get philosophical about the green bridge effect. This concept refers to the phenomena where a continuous supply of living host plants allows pests, weeds, or disease to survive and seamlessly transition from one cropping system to the next. It bridges the gap across the winter or some other fallow period where the primary cash crop isn't growing. There's several examples in the plant disease world where there is strong evidence of viruses overwintering in weeds or other wild plants growing in and around fields. Farms affected by these diseases adopt aggressive sanitation practice, destroying volunteer crops that sprout up after harvest. They practice crop rotation, so that's alternating the crop that is not a host for the primary crop pest. So, for example, a disease that affects a grass cash crop like corn, you'd alternate that with a broadleaf cover crop or some other broadleaf vegetable crop. There are even scenarios where fungal diseases that cause rust or mildews can overwinter on the plants we use as cover crops. For folks who have seen a buildup of fungal inoculum over time, it is recommended to allow at least 2 to 3 weeks between terminating the cover crop before planting the cash crop, creating a brown period where the pests starve before the new crop emerges. That might be a lot to ask depending on what your timeline is like. As far as we know, there hasn't been any work done on overwintered onions becoming a green bridge for any insect pests. But if there had been work, it probably would have been on thrips because they tend to thrive in greenhouse conditions. Before we consider whether or not these thrips are a threat to crops outside the tunnel, Elisabeth wanted to consider what the threshold is for avoiding crop damage to the tunnel crop itself. In integrated pest management parlance, this is the kind of pest population that indicates there will be crop loss in the future. The action threshold is where you should take action before seeing crop loss to the pest. If we want to get really fancy, we talk about economic threshold, where you are relying on prediction models that balance the cost of the intervention with the cost that you anticipate losing to the pest. I hope that makes sense. We'll talk about that more. This would typically be the point in the podcast where I offer some paper, some scientific evidence that could help, or reach out to some expert. But Elisabeth is the expert here and already had plenty of folks on the vegetable team to reach out to and bounce some ideas around with, including someone who spends more of their time working with those large-scale onion growers we talked about earlier.
My name's Ethan Grunberg. I'm also a vegetable specialist on the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program, which maybe gets the award for the worst acronym of any of the regional teams in the Cornell Cooperative Extension System. ENYCHP. I'm based in the Hudson Valley, and one of the groups that I get to work with in my role is the group of larger scale conventional onion growers in Orange County, New York, on the famous Black Dirt, a big deposit of about 10,000 plus acres of contiguous muck soils, really high organic matter, former wetland. We're talking organic matter percentages of up to 80% in some of these soils. It's basically like growing in a giant bowl of compost. And so one of the advantages to that system is that you have really high water holding capacity and you have perfect tilth basically all the time with very little effort. So it makes growing sort of finicky crops like onions, direct seeded, much more possible than in other soil types. Over the years, you see different estimates of how many onions are grown in the region. Right now, we're settling in the area around 3,500 up to about 4,000 acres of onions on any given year. About 70% of that is direct seeded, with the other 30% mostly being bare root transplanted. Growers will contract bare root onion production from a commercial operation in Arizona. Those plants are harvested and then shipped up in crates and left on pallets for weeks, and it seems like they shouldn't survive, but without fail, every year they do just fine. And then there's a smaller fraction of the onions that are grown from plugs, contracted from Canadian greenhouses and then transplanted with transplanters. So I spent a lot of my time doing pest, disease, and weed management work, applied research in those fields, and working very closely with that group of growers.
Right. And you are well abreast of the traditional methods of controlling thrips, which may or may not be appropriate for high tunnels. Did you have any advice for, applying what we think about for thrips control to these tunnels if they decided they needed to control them in the tunnels?
Yeah. And I mean, I should share a deep, dark secret, which is that I used to be an organic farmer as well. So I have a lot of applied experience with organic thrips management and other organic controls in vegetable production as well. This is always like one of those questions, right? Where a grower who's really savvy and like overachiever will go and they'll come to me and be like, oh, it looks like my flea beetle threshold is like 1 per leaf and I think I'm getting close. And like, what do I do? You're like, well, your tactic is using row cover. So like, what are we talking about? Like, I appreciate the academic exercise that you went through of understanding, tolerance of some insect pest pressure here, but it's totally inapplicable to your like 22 bed feet of arugula that you're covering with Rime, right? Like, let's just take that off the table right now. And I feel like the same is maybe not as extreme as that example, but certainly like parallel to that with this conversation, right? So I work very closely with the entomologist, Dr. Brian Nault at Cornell, who does a lot of applied research in allium pests generally and has done a tremendous amount of work over the years developing very, very refined thrips management programs for conventional onion growers in the state. And so it's gotten so refined, I think when I started in this position 10 years, it was like, 1 to 2 thrips per leaf. That's our threshold. And now, Brian and his lab have come out with these stepwise, depending on which insecticide you're spraying at which leaf stage, your tolerance for thrips is going to be radically different. One of our early systemic chemistries like Senstar or Movento that we might be using to control thrips aren't very good on adults, and we want to get them in the plant before bulbing. So we have, a threshold of like 0.6 to 0.8 thrips per leaf. But then as we get into the later season and we have heavier duty chemistries that we can lean on, like some of Syngenta's new chemistries with planazoline technology, we can tolerate 2 to 3 thrips per leaf. So it's like very well developed with a lot of evidence and research backing, how those different thresholds translate to yield loss or gain, right? But so then again, it's like we take that system where we're talking about on average, probably an onion field, at least in Orange County, is on like the 5 to 6 acre range, typically, like a single field. And the average onion farm side is probably growing about 60 to 80 acres of onions. And so we're thinking of that sort of system of production. We're also thinking about a system of production where there's not a lot of rotation year after year. This is very high value, a concentrated deposit of muck soil. You can't rotate very far. And even if you could, it's a patchwork of ownership. So you might rotate your onions as far as you can, but you're rotating right next to your neighbor who decides they're growing onions right next to where you're going, right? So you're just never able to use some of those kind of cultural control tactics in the same way, which means we know that we're going to have onion thrips pressure every single year, and we have to prepare for it, and we have to intervene. There's a huge host plant range for them to just enjoy a buffet on all season long. It's a totally different system, right? So I'm talking about this for a really long way, but all to like reinforce when Elisabeth reached out was like, I don't know, like what lessons do we learn from conventional thrips management to translate to this system? I was like, I don't know how much really applies. So there are some reference points that I think are useful, right? And so there's like the broader question I feel like here, which is like, is it worth it? Growers typically fall asleep during these parts of presentations where you're like, let's talk about the life cycle and the host plant range of every insect pest. But it's like super important for this conversation, right? Because if you have onion thrips who are overwintering in a high tunnel in an onion planting, where typically, again, like you were saying, Anna, it's like one of the goals of these overwintered onions is you avoid all the pest pressure, right? You don't get the foliar diseases, you don't get the thrips pressure, you get these beautiful unsullied onions without having to do anything. But if you're growing year round or late into the fall and you have onion thrips and you have onion thrips in your cabbage, because onion thrips like brassica crops too. Guess what? You can also find them on lettuce. And so if they're on these alternative, lesser preferred hosts, and then you're planting your overwintered onions and they're moving into that like beautifully protected high tunnel space where they can hang out all winter long and then just blow up in the early spring. And then you have your next planting of cabbage like right outside the tunnel. It's a more complicated sort of like, how do we feed this all into our mental algorithm of, does it make sense to do anything? Because my initial reaction was, given the tools that we have for organic production, especially with all the constraints that Elisabeth already mentioned in New York about what we can and cannot use in high tunnel production, leaning on some research that's been done in Dr. Brian Nault's lab again by Dr. Lindsay Iglesias, who's now in private industry, but a great entomologist as well. The one thing that we had that seemed to reliably do anything to thrips in organic systems is entrust, spinosad. And specifically combining entrust with effective adjuvants that are kind of enhancing the translaminar activity of that product. So spinosad is one of the few OMRI-listed insecticide chemistries that can actually go through the leaf tissue into the inside part of the leaf and then like move sort of locally, systemically to the other side of a leaf as well, which when we're talking about onion thrips that are really tough to get at with contact chemistries like pyrethrins or a lot of the other commonly used insecticides that we have, that's like one of the reasons that entrust works so well compared to your other options, onion thrips and organic system. We can't use that in New York in a high tunnel because it doesn't have that greenhouse language on it. If you were somewhere else, if you were in New Hampshire or wherever else and you wanted to use entrust, I'd say, it might be worth combining entrust with an adjuvant that might enhance that translaminar activity to knock that thrips population down. But in this case, I was like, you know what? It's probably not worth doing it until we are thinking about what are those other crops around the area that are alternative hosts that are probably going to get hammered after those onions are out of there. And that's where Elisabeth and I kind of stuck in our conversation.
As an extension person who's visiting these farms weekly, just on a professional and personal level, it feels kind of crummy just to tell people not to do anything about a pest population where there's like literally 30 to 40 thrips per plant. So the do nothing approach, Ethan mentioned the arugula and flea beetle example, the row cover. It is tough when you visit a farm and an organic grower has a a problem that's gotten out of hand and they ask what they should do about it. But the answer really was you should have prevented it. And that's kind of the only thing you could do at this point.
That's 100% my experience with extension writ large, is that like, as an entomologist, I don't know enough about people's process, right? So like, the solution to a lot of these problems is just to sit down and be like, okay, like, how do you do this? Like, let's go through the year. And that seems very invasive. That seems like a little too personal, but I think that's really what they're asking. But in this case, it sounds like somebody who has overwintered onions, they're seeing thrips kind of build up in the springtime. Say they've decided that thrips population isn't as severe as the one that you're talking about. They're not seeing crop loss in the onions. They would do nothing. But the other question of like, is this exacerbating my thrips problem writ large? That's one that like I think is very interesting. So what I think I'm going to do is, I can't get a hold of anybody this time of year to ask them their opinions. If it was colder out, maybe we could ask some of these experts to like scratch their beards about it. I want to look and dig into the literature, because something that like high tunnel researchers are very interested in, since we've seen such an influx of like NRCS money, like we're seeing these high tunnels just dotting the environment in a way that's not being captured by like ag census data, is to say like, every little small diversified farm is all of a sudden establishing like a little patch of California in their New York farm. Is that creating this bridge kind of situation? So I'm going to see if I can find any evidence on a landscape in any pest situation where like this is making things better or worse, or do things kind of balance out?
Backing up to your point again, Anna, earlier about that like more personal question, like what's the grower's approach more broadly? Like, how do you approach farming? Where it's like, yeah, I mean, the goal of improving soil health and having something green growing in a high tunnel year round, like that feels like a good thing, right? Like, it just feels like that's what organic production is all about. I've done research back in the past too, where we saw that even just maintaining moist soil environment with some cover crop in there improved our nitrogen availability moving into a winter greens crop, right? So like, multiple benefits. Why would we not do this? Oh, well, maybe now what we're doing is we're creating a nightmare situation for ourselves for thrips and cutworm and everything else. And I feel like that conversation is really tough. I feel like we have it a lot with farmers.
Another research trial that we're doing at the Willsboro farm is overwintered cover crops. And so we have winter rye, peas, crimson clover, tillage radish, oats, bare ground control. Those were our treatments that we seeded in September, terminated them before tomato planting. In general, I'm curious about, the life cycle of insect pests and diseases in high tunnels, when now I might be promoting true year-round green plant matter in a high tunnel. I saw a lot of cutworms in there over the winter, but in terms of things like thrips and whatever else, I didn't do thorough scouting on those cover crop plants, which maybe I should have in retrospect.
Okay, listeners, at this point, you might be asking yourself, why is this even a question? Could there be an effect of having a rip-roaring thrips outbreak in your overwintered onions in April or May? Could it impact your open culture onions throughout the rest of the year? Like, what gives with these nerds belaboring over the obvious? Like, yeah, of course. Seems obvious that starting out the season with more thrips means those populations are just going to grow throughout the year. But my bias here is my experience with greenhouse pests. Time and time again, we'll see aphids or thrips on a greenhouse-grown plant that we put outside, and those pets just disappear. It's not magic or anything. Those pest infestations that develop through the winter in a tunnel, and we roll up the sides of the high tunnel, you can't find them by the middle of the summer. It's all those natural enemies. It's what we call a top-down effect on pest population. They come and eat them up. So us nerds, well, maybe me nerd, just can't bring ourselves to only look at bottom-up influences on pest populations here. By that, I'm thinking mostly about the bottom-up effects of all these delicious onions we're growing that do a great job of supporting thrips populations. We just don't know who else is showing up to the party to do the dirty work for us. So it's really hard to recommend that our small-scale growers take any action, especially if they're expensive actions, unless we have a sense of how much that action will contribute. I've been reading a bunch of papers looking at landscape-level influences on pest severity. Here are some of the top factors: landscape simplification, spatial availability, low elevation topography, and proximity to overwintering refuges. So landscape simplification, monocultures, we generally think that this almost always makes pest densities worse. So high intensive agricultural systems that result in simplified landscape structures cause a significant loss of functional biodiversity. This eliminates those natural enemies, those top-down effects on population, thereby reducing the ecosystem service of natural pest control, leaving crops more vulnerable to outbreaks. Up here in New York, we are growing in ecosystems that are incredibly diverse compared to large-scale operations in other parts of the country. The second point, spatial availability of the hosts. We're talking about patchiness, isolated gardens, isolated fields. This can make pest densities better, and sometimes it can make it worse. We talk about this a ton in urban agriculture because sometimes isolated gardens don't have a ton of pest problems because the pests just haven't found them yet. And then sometimes they have horrible pest problems because it's also hard for those pests' natural enemies to find them. It feels totally random. Well, because it is. All right, the third point, low elevation topography and thermal volatility. Just the top line here, there's some places where pest populations can be worse in local microclimates that experience high temperatures for longer periods of time. Something to think about. Then that last one, proximity to overwintering refuges. This is something that caught my attention, and I was trying to find some examples of what we know about pest complexes where proximity to overwintering refuges really impacts pest problems throughout the year. So there's a ton of pest species that we know spend their winters in protected areas surrounding cultivated fields. And we know we can expect to see an edge effect where crop damage is more severe in the rows closest to those refuges. There's plenty of those examples, and there's plenty of examples where sprays that are applied just to border rows provided equivalent control to spraying the whole field if they were timed for that window where the overwintered populations of pests were migrating into the fields from the refuges. But examples of folks going into those spaces to take down pest populations, those are few and far between. And like I mentioned before, there isn't any work specifically looking at overwintered onions in a tunnel, but you can start to see how these top-down and bottom-up effects make someone like me really stop in their tracks and struggle to give a straight answer. All right, back to my conversation with Elisabeth and Ethan. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Elisabeth, once you said, okay, not only do we have no good information about thresholds coming from outdoor systems because it's just not appropriate for your overwintered indoor onions, but you can't really use these chemistries because of pesticide laws. So obviously your mind went to biocontrol. So tell me what you learned there.
Yeah, I reached out to one of our biocontrol companies in the state, and the entomologist there had some interesting information, and she had relayed experience she had working with an organic grower in the Midwest in, I think, northern Minnesota, similar climate, growing high tunnel onions and outdoor onions organically. They had really great luck working with nematodes for thrips control. The entomologist at this biocontrol company was recommending Steinernema feltiae, specifically with a wetting agent. Since the thrips are in the new leaves, kind of protected with a wetting agent that theoretically creates a protected kind of moist environment for the nematodes to thrive compared to other foliar applications potentially. So that was her recommendation. I know, yes, predatory mites are recommended from some other sources, but her advice was not to go that route, just from her experience working with other clients where those were not effective. So I happened to be working with a different organic grower who had overwintered onion thrips in her high tunnel. She was going to apply nematodes for a different pest. I thought, since you have them, just try spraying some on your onions and see what happens, and I'll have to report back if anything came of that. So that was kind of what I gleaned from doing just a little bit of research on biocontrol. And again, would it be worth it to spend the money on this?
I think it's a terrific question. And I don't know that there's great information out there on a whole because people use tunnels so differently. Like if only people use tunnels in a similar way, could we do some research that would look at averages? My experience with the tunnel conditions that you're talking about, like the application, is that it feels like that reduced UV environment would make you be more likely to succeed. Because everybody I've ever talked to about nematodes, it's like that joke from Anchorman, 60% of the time it works every time. Because everybody's like, oh, like nematodes are the solution to all of our problems. And then like you put them out in like the middle of the summer and like they're all toast before they even hit the ground. But gosh, high tunnels seem like a really good application. The advice I've given for people is that like, if you can get the conditions right, it's worth it. The biggest expense is in shipping. Every time you use it, it's like $100 a pop just because like you need to get them to you safely. So that might be something that's just more a matter of like, do you have the time and patience to do it? Are you willing to take that hit? And then maybe we can talk about the severity of the problem. So here we can lean on the literature a little bit and talk about cold tolerance of thrips and efficacy of entomopathogenic nematodes, or EPNs, for thrips management. So I was lucky enough to participate in a research project in collaboration with Purdue University and the University of Illinois. That project is actually wrapping up and starting to publish a ton of their work right now. But we were looking at year-round pest and weed incidents in tunnels, specifically looking at weed species in these tunnels to see if they could be green bridges. Anecdotally, we didn't see much evidence of this in New Hampshire, although the other groups in Indiana and Illinois, every once in a while, they did see this, specifically with a species of aphid, that is the potato aphid. It's a species we just don't see very often up here in the Northeast. All species of aphid are incredibly cold hardy, and they are happy to keep producing on a cold-tolerant crop straight through the winter. They are just pooping out babies. They have no problem. For the most part, we didn't see those species transfer to summer crops except for that potato aphid species. Usually, all the natural enemies that were in the quiescent or diapausing state during the winter would then emerge in the spring and take care of business, as expected. What we do know about thrips is they overwinter as adults in the soil or plant debris, and they enter a reproductive quiescence that is triggered by cold temperatures. So the difference between a reproductive quiescence and a diapause is like they basically just shut down reproduction while it's cold out. So it's not a true diapause, so that reproductive ability will just come back again when it's warm enough. According to the 1986 paper I read from North and Shelton, what's up, Tony? Thrips tabaci, this is the species we're talking about on onion, will happily lay their eggs in winter wheat, oats, alfalfa, and weedy vegetation. So it would be well worth looking into this. But there's some good news when it comes to EPNs, those entomopathogenic beneficial nematodes. And we are drawing on what we know from the greenhouse world. So keep in mind, we know that thrips split their life cycle between the plant canopy and the soil. So there's an opportunity to manage them in the leaves of the onion as well as the soil-dwelling life stage that is like right at the surface of the soil. Well, we know that EPNs are naturally adapted to the soil. Above ground treatments can be a little trickier because of their UV sensitivity. But if you remember, these are low UV light environments. So it is standard practice in many greenhouse industries to use EPMs for fungus gnat control in the containers. And it's becoming more and more common to see foliar applications with those adjuvants that Elisabeth mentioned for pests that live above ground. In reading about this in the literature, it's quite normal. However, greenhouses are very sterile environments, especially if you're talking about container-grown plants. And regular applications of biocontrols in those cultures are pretty standard practice. Like they're out there every week or every couple of weeks, year-round, relying on these biocontrols. Our tunnels are quite a bit different from that point of view, as well as our tunnel growers. But I still think that a foliar drench of these nematodes would do some very good work of knocking down above and below ground populations of thrips. And, even if it's just one and done for that year, I think it'll knock them back. I actually think there's some potential for those thrips to persist in those soils because there's more life in the soil than there is in a sterile container where we expect them to go and kill our fungus gnats and die. Our tunnel soils, they're probably a little bit healthier for those nematodes, and maybe the nematodes will thrive. I don't know, but I think it's worth it. If you want to throw down the cash to spend that $100 a pop, or if you have a ton of tunnels to treat all at once, I think it's worth it.
I think at this point, thinking everything through, acknowledging the cost of interventions, talking with Ethan, etc., I am comfortable with the do nothing approach for the onion thrips, just carefully observing everyone's overwintered onions every week. They have decent bulb size. They're going to be able to sell them. There's little to no foliar disease. I think it's going to turn out okay. And if they have onion thrips in their outdoor onions, they can spray them with interest. Then that's where I'm at.
Man, that sounds like a really nice conclusion.
It's maybe not the most satisfying, but I think I don't know, otherwise, I think that's where I'm at.
All right, I'll leave it there. It was a real joy to talk to these folks. So thank you very much to Elisabeth and Ethan. And we definitely talked about a ton of other pest crop complexes that need some attention here. So like normal, I'm leaving with more questions and answers, but I want to learn more about what folks are seeing. Do you have any of these issues in mind? Do you think you have horse thrips problems on onions ever since you started overwintering onions? Are your leaf miner problems worse during the years when you started seeing them in tunnel crops first? I want to know more. So thank you very much for listening, and please reach out. Serious Grower Podcast is a production of New Hampshire Community Supported Research. If you are interested in becoming a co-host or would like to learn more about our mission to democratize agricultural research, visit our website at nhcsr.org. If you want to learn more about anything we're talking about, make sure to check out our YouTube channel at NHCSR, where we're sharing insights from the agricultural research community and blogging about our research efforts on the farm. You can support this work by liking and subscribing, and even better, consider joining our Patreon community.